Okay. So today we're going to be talking about walking on their heads, writing with their hearts, American Jewish immigration stories. And I want to start off by just reflecting that really all immigrant experiences share certain elements, even if those experiences look different because of the country and culture of origin. So just to kind of give a visual, here we have an image of 6 different immigrant writers across the really late 19th century through contemporary. I don't know who any of these people are. Okay, so I'll just point out clockwise, starting from the top left. We have Shalom Aleichem on the top left. Anzia Yazirska, probably the least known among these. We will be talking about her a little bit later. Mary Anton, who wrote a book called The Promised Land about her experiences. Mary, the name Mary notwithstanding, a little misleading, she was a Jewish immigrant to the United States. Isaac Bashevis Singer. Jhumpa Lahiri, who many of you may know, one of my favorite authors. And Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Nigerian author, a very, very well-known, very, very beloved contemporarily. And selecting only 6 was a challenge. Right? Immigrant writing is pervasive, especially as America has become increasingly a country of immigrants. And these are all American immigrant authors. Actually, Jhumpa Lahiri is British, but very much appeals to a wide audience, including an American audience.
So just ask you a question. What time are you ending?
12:30 is my goal. So in general, to continue with the broad reflections before we narrow ourselves down to the American Jewish experience. So in general, immigrant writing tends to reflect the bewilderment and the challenges and really the longings of the immigrants for their homeland, for their home culture, and for acculturation into the country in which they've arrived. Some of the characters in the novels and the autobiographies of all of these writers slowly adjust to the cultural clash that they inevitably encounter. Others really never fully come to terms with the values of an alien culture. And all of them live the inevitable tension between the immigrant generation and its children, and in some cases even that 3rd generation. That is a repeated theme for all of these writers and many more. All this is true as well about specifically the immigrant experience, the Jewish immigrant experience in the United States. So today, we'll be looking at how Jewish East European immigrants, we'll be focusing specifically on East European immigration, who arrived in the United States during the Great Wave of immigration, told their stories. So we won't be doing an exploration of every aspect of the history. We'll be looking at how they told their own stories, either in autobiographical format or in novel format. And through those stories, that will serve as a lens for the actual immigrant history, hopefully with a lot of visuals and audio, which I tested out and all should work. A little bit of historical background about what I just termed this great wave of East European immigration. Okay. In 1880, about 250,000 Jews lived in the United States. Most had arrived in the 19th century from Germany and other West and Central European countries. We actually don't have great data from before 1881 about the year by year how many arrived. We know that a good number arrived after 1848, which was the year of the German, one of the steps toward German unification. Other periods of time, there were other spikes, but by 1880, 250,000 Jews had arrived. And most people who came would come from Central and East and West European countries, had really come seeking economic fortune. They were not looking to escape any kind of persecution, and in fact, Germany throughout the 19th century was increasingly a comfortable, safe place for Jews. Over the next 40 years, from 1880 to 1924 or so, 44 years, the total population of Jews in the United States grew more than tenfold. Look at 1924, a huge increase over the course of about 44 years. This is because during that period of time, there was an influx of 2.5 million Jews from Eastern Europe, primarily Russia, but also Poland and other areas in that general part of the world. And they were coming almost exclusively to escape anti-Semitism. Why do we say 1880 is the beginning? Around 1880, 1881? Because in 1881, Tsar Alexander II in Russia was assassinated. And as was pretty common in those times, it didn't take a long time for the Jews of Russia to be blamed for that. It was later discovered and corroborated that Russian fanatics, Russian non-Jewish fanatics, had killed him. But because of these rumors that Jews had killed Tsar Alexander II, a wave of pogroms started across Russia, and especially in the Pale of Settlement where the Jews were living. And so that was really a huge impetus for lots of Russian Jews to leave as fast as they possibly could. In addition to the pogroms and vicious, violent anti-Semitism, they also led to the May Laws of 1882. The May Laws of 1882 forced hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews to live only within the confines of the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement, which is in that western edge of the Russian Empire. Pale of Settlement had pre-existed 1882, but in the May Laws of 1882, following the rumors that Tsar Alexander II had been assassinated by Jews, the May Laws forced Jews to live exclusively in that area. And so you have Jews escaping real, clear, concrete persecution. There are various dips and rises along the way here, right? So just for a little bit more of the historical data here, right? So for example, if you look at 1914, we have 138,051. I can share this with you personally if you email me, because it's a really interesting chart, which is hard to see if you're not right up here. There's 138,000 people who immigrated in 1914, but of course between 1915 and 1919, we see a very serious dip, because the United States put enacted immigration quotas during World War I. 1920, we're back up to 14,000. By 1921, we're already back up. If you look at the numbers here, though, 1923, we're at about 50,000. We're about 50,000. And then it dips once again pretty precipitously in 1924. 10,000, and then all the numbers moving all the way up to when we get toward the beginning of World War II are low. The reason for that is that in 1924, the United States government established the 1924 Immigration Act, which was otherwise known as the Johnson-Reed Act, whose explicit purpose, according to the United States, the State Department, was to preserve the ideal of American homogeneity. Now, just want to point out that this was not the first time that a broad immigration quota had been enacted in the United States. The first broad, meaning across cultures, across nationalities, immigration quota in the United States had been enacted by Congress in 1917, when it was easy to do. Right, the trend toward, or the inclination toward being afraid of immigrants and being afraid of what they brought to the country, certainly pre-existed 1924, pre-existed 1917. But in 1917, the security concerns surrounding World War I made it very easy to enact such a quota. So, for example, in 1917, Congress enacted a literacy test for immigrants, and also increased the tax that immigrants had to pay upon arrival. Over the next several years, there were restrictive quotas that were enacted and modified, culminating with the Johnson-Reed Act, which was voted by Congress and signed by President Coolidge in 1924. And I just want to point out that a few major points of the Johnson-Reed Act were, first of all, that immigration visas were to be granted to not more than 2% of the population of each nationality then living in the United States, right? So, right, you got that, okay? Now, just to be clear, that wasn't the first time such a quota had been enacted. 2% was down for the previous 3%. Right? But that's large. We're talking about real numbers when we talk about a population that had gone up to 2.75 million. In addition, Congress pushed. How do you get that population data? How many there are in the first place from the census? In order to determine what that 2% would be, Congress pushed back the data from the 1910 to the 1890 census. So you're establishing 2% based on 1890 numbers and not based on 1910 numbers. Okay. By the way, this was not about Jews. It affected Jews greatly, but it was not about Jews. It was about immigrants. And in fact, Asians were totally excluded through this act. And that was because of nationality and citizenship laws related to Asians that dated as far back as the late 18th century. But the Jews clearly not only were very much impacted by these quotas, but because of their precarious position in Eastern Europe and across Europe, they were among those who most seriously needed to leave. Right? So this was a very difficult situation. Okay, that gives us the context for why Jews arrived and also what kind of culture they arrived into. A culture in which was very diverse, in which the country was limiting immigration because of an increase in immigration, right? That indicates to us that there was an increasing diversity of nationalities. But at the same time, a lot of what we're going to focus on is actually not what the other people had to say about and to Jews, but what happened internally within Jewish communities. One good starting point for exploring the narratives of Jewish immigration, as I said, we'll be looking at this through the lens of the stories that they told, is considering the immigrants' expectations about what life would be like once they arrived. There was not just one monolithic expectation, but we can gain insight from Shalom Aleichem, first person on that slide, who wrote a lullaby for children while still living in Odessa in 1892, and that was 14 years before he arrived here. Okay, so this is not working as well as I wanted, but we're going to get to it. Okay, that's it. The lullaby is called Schlaf mein Kind, or Sleep My Child. Now, I'm going to play it a little bit. You'll hear a woman's voice on a recording, so that you can kind of associate the words a little bit with the Yiddish singing of it. Hold on a moment. Let's see if I can do it from here. Hold on a second. Slide. Okay. Go.
Schlaf, mein Kind, mein Trist, mein Schöner, schlaf schön, Schlaf, mein Leben, mein Kaddisch, Schöner, schlaf schön, Bei dein Wiegel sitzt dein Mama, singt ein Lied ohne Wein. Wirst einmal verstehen, Miss Dame, was sie hat gemeint. Wirst einmal verstehen, Miss Dame, was sie hat gemeint. In Amerika ist der Tate deine Sonne.
That's where you get to the first stanza. So now that you hear the melody, right? You can imagine, right? A mother, usually it would be a mother, singing this lullaby to a child. This was written again in Odessa, and if you look at here, we have really this almost stereotypical, right, vision of the Golden Medina, right? The expectation. America is pure luck. For Jews, it is a paradise and a pure wonder. Challah is eaten even on weekdays in America. When we get there, I will cook broths for you. Your father will send us $20 and his photograph too. He will bring us there. May he live long. Right? And in many cases, this actually happened. In some cases, it didn't, and there was no ability to send money back. But certainly, it sets an expectation here for what Jews were looking for in the Golden Medina, in the Golden Land. Now we'll look at the reality through the immigration stories. And the first thing we're going to do is focus a little bit on the encounter the encounter and confrontation when it came to religious life specifically. Excuse me. Moshe Weinberger was a Hungarian rabbi, so he came from a country that was really at the crossroads between Eastern and Western Europe culturally. A Hungarian rabbi who immigrated to the United States in 1880 at the age of 26, and he settled in New York, as most immigrants at the time did. His book, Jews and Judaism in New York, was written in Hebrew, and I should add that it was translated by the very prominent and wonderful historian of American Jewish history, Jonathan Sarna, into a book called People Walk on Their Heads, and you'll see in a moment that that's taken directly from Weinberger's book. Here in this book, Weinberger recorded his mostly negative impressions of Jewish orthodoxy in the late 19th century, specifically in New York. He had come from a part of Europe, again, that it was at this cultural crossroads, but he arrived along with that wave of East European immigrants, and culturally he was very similar to them because he was a religious, observant Jew. Writing this book in Hebrew meant that his audience was necessarily his fellow Jews and those who were literate enough in the Hebrew language to understand it. It's worth considering about the audience. You're writing to your own kind, not only your own kind Jewishly, but for your own kind intellectually. In discussing American Jewish orthodoxy, here's a really important quote, including from my title, where he writes, This, the new world, is a world turned upside down. People walk on their heads in Columbus's land, not on their feet. Everything for him was topsy-turvy. It was an orthodoxy, it was a religious world that could have been not even Jewish in some ways. So a good example of that is where he's focused on synagogues and what synagogues looked like. He notes that most Orthodox shuls in New York have a minyan, have services every day at their center, and also have as their purpose bikur cholim, right, visiting the sick, funeral assistance, burials, and financial assistance for members in need. But he adds, and I quote, their more exalted aim is to build beautifully adorned synagogues. Every congregation that succeeds in doing this is boundlessly happy. Its members think that in this way they have fulfilled their every duty to Judaism. In this piece, Weinberger is alluding to what historians or sociologists have termed American Jews' edifice complex, striving to build ever larger and more ornate shuls. Take as an example the Eldred Street Synagogue, right, which was refurbished and it's beautiful, and there's a museum at its center, and you can visit it on the Lower East Side. The Eldred Street Synagogue was built by East European Jews right in time for the Yamim Noraim in 1887, which is the year that Weinberger's book was published. So he actually witnessed it. He had arrived 7 years earlier. He witnessed it in its building. So it's a perfect example of what he was referring to. And they were making themselves a home for davening. Now, some Jews viewed these buildings as appropriate for attracting a broad population of worshipers and in instilling institutional pride for congregants, especially in light of Reform Judaism that was very much pervasive, very widespread in America, and who really had adopted the Protestant model of big, ornate, beautiful churches to draw their congregants in. So many people thought, well, this is a good way of attracting those Jews, right, to us, or Jews who might be on the fence, very similar to what had been happening in Germany. Others, such as Weinberger, had a much more derisive attitude, not only because these elaborate structures were so antithetical to the houses of worship, or the shtiblach, really, that they had experienced, that they'd been used to in Eastern Europe, but also because they viewed them as wasteful financially, right, placing unnecessary burdens of debt on their congregants when the money could be much better used toward other causes, particularly while the East European Jews had escaped persecution, as I said. What they had also experienced in Eastern Europe and were finding in America was a lot of poverty. And so the idea that the money should be invested in this, for many people, was just really antithetical to the values that the Jewish community should adopt. Another source of frustration for Weinberger was his observation that shul membership in New York did not embody the hierarchical structure that he had experienced in Hungary, did not embody that hierarchy. This hierarchy of more important and less important, right, of more mechubad and less mechubad, was dependent in Eastern Europe and in East Central Europe on social and familial and educational status. Here he was witness to a much more democratic shul environment. And I quote, "In all other lands, congregants are unequal and treated accordingly, each man attaining honors commensurate with his status and worth. In America, all are equal and treated alike." And even more contemptuously, he adds, "The less consequential members of our people who never previously held opinions of their own, and who prior to their emigration had always been forced to answer an amen to assent to every idea that other people had put into their heads, had here earned the right to express their opinions publicly. They no longer have to depend on any counsel or opinion save their own. So here we have the words of a rabbi mourning not only his own authority, really, it's sad, but also the unqualified authority that had been vested in the institution of the rabbinate. As Professor Sarna writes in his introduction to People Walk on Their Heads, Orthodoxy had to learn what all religious groups in America must inevitably learn. In a voluntary state, religion can operate only by persuasion. In the United States, right, where religion had never been mandated, a rabbi's authority always has been and continues to be as powerful as the extent to which people feel beholden to it. This was new for Weinberger, and it was tragic for him. And I should also mention that he was never able to find a post in the United States. It really upended his whole perception of the rabbinate and hurt him on a deeply personal level. Okay. Jewish immigrants to America during this period settled in various urban areas, right? Not only in New York, also in Chicago and in Philadelphia and in areas south of here, north of here. But the single largest area, and I'm sure we all know, of Jewish East European settlement was not only New York, but New York's Lower East Side, which was an easily accessible destination from Ellis Island. So we're going to keep our focus there for the sake of a focus and for the sake of time. 85% of the Lower East Side at the turn of the 20th century was Jewish immigrants. Think about that number for a moment.
Oh, 85?
85. Many of the others were Italians. That was the next largest. 85%, a huge percentage comprising the Lower East Side of Manhattan at the turn of the 20th century. So to get some contemporaneous insight into the Lower East Side experience, we'll now focus on our next author. His name is Gershom Rosenzweig. He was a Lithuanian Jew who immigrated to the United States in 1888. Just for some perspective, a year after Weinberger published his book. Rosenzweig had taught Hebrew in Lithuania, and after settling in the United States, he actually edited various Hebrew language periodicals and wrote several books himself, including Masechet America. Okay. This was published in 1907, so about 9 years after he arrived. And this really is a very sharply humorous and cynical critique on American society. It comprises one of 6 volumes in his more broad Talmud Yankai, the Yankee Talmud. Okay. All this stuff. Other Masechtot in Talmud Yankai, you can see the small print there, include Masechet Hedyotot, which is basically the tractate of laymen or dilettantes, Masechet Kezavim, the tractate of deceits, and a few others. Those tractates focus on specific areas of American life. For example, Masechet Kezavim, or the tractate of deceits, actually is devoted to the ludicrousness of April Fool's Day. An example, right? Masechet. I'm sorry? April Fool's Day. April Fool's Day. Yeah.
Was to what? Masechet what?
Masechet Kezavim, which means deceits, essentially. It focuses on the craziness or the foolishness of April Fool's Day. Masechet Masveh is a Masechet of masks, so other kinds of deceits. Okay. We're going to focus on the Masechet America, which offers more general impressions. The layout of Masechet America is, as for all of these Masechtot, for him, is exactly identical, or identical, it emulates the layout of a Talmud page. Its linguistic style is identical to that of the Talmud, if you look at it carefully. Let me just point out that this model of Talmudic parody was not new at all. In that period, it goes back as far as Kalonymus ben Kalonymus, who was a 14th century physician and translator who lived in Italy and published Masechet Purim, which offers also funny Talmudic style debates about the customs of Purim, including a debate on drunkenness, so also a social critique, a social satire. In our case, this kind of traditional model really accomplishes, I would say, 2 opposite effects. Right? On the one hand, it places Rosenzweig's critique in a very serious frame, the frame of the Talmud. It doesn't get more compelling than that, while also at the same time really mitigating the harshness of that critique by turning Talmudic style on its head, in amusing and ironic ways. In that sense, it differs greatly from Rosenzweig's Jews and Judaism in New York. From Weinberger's Jews and Judaism in New York. Weinberger's style is straightforward. His writing is very straightforward. It sometimes exhorts his fellow Jews, but it's never funny. He really stopped short of being funny. It's said, clearly a difference between his and Rosenzweig's books is that Masechet America is meant in part to entertain, and also possibly to offer a fraternal kind of insider's wink toward its intended audience, which was, in this case, men who were familiar with the Talmud, right? An even narrower, well, I don't know if it was narrower, different in some ways, maybe overlapping, but somewhat different audience than for Jews and Judaism in New York. This distinction is important in considering the variety of immigrant responses to the culture clash that many of them faced in their new homes, right? What these two men have in common, Weinberger and Rosenzweig, is their attitudes toward America and American Judaism, and that which is some degree of shock and condescension and rejection, even though their audiences are slightly different and their frame, the way that they present it, is different. Rosenzweig offers critiques on Jewish religion in America and also on the social and political culture. So I want to focus on the social and political culture for a few moments right now. One of the Mishnahs in Masechet America reads, I'm translating it into English, the following are obligated to work: men, women, and children who have reached the age of education. Rabbi Anya said, anyone who is obligated to eat is obligated to work. Now, Anya is written the way that you would write ani, as in with an ayin, meaning poor, right? So he's really very much alluding to the poverty here. Excuse me. So like many of his contemporaries, Rosenzweig was very attuned to the harsh realities of child labor. Right? And anyone who not only is anyone who has reached the age of education should work, really anyone who needs to eat should be working, in his satire. Right? So he's very much attuned to child labor in the urban setting, especially among the destitute immigrant population. He was also commenting in here in general on the poverty-ridden lives of those living on the Lower East Side. So I want to a little bit focus on what that looked like. I'm sure many of you have seen at least some of these images before, but let's try to get a sense of Rosenzweig's context here. So here we have the sort of crowdedness of the Lower East Side in this period. This is a shot taken from that time period. Of many immigrants, and again, most of the ones you're looking at here are Jews, with the occasional Italians inside. Not much room to move around. A lot of peddlers, which was the most common profession at the time, and living in very, very close quarters. Here we have a similar shot, less crowded on the bottom, but what this shot does is it gives us a look at the tenements, right, which were the very, very well-known living residences of people in this area, extremely cramped. People living in very close quarters with very poor ventilation, which they still had to pay rent. And just to get a little further into the tenements, right? Whoever hasn't been to the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side, highly recommend it. Here's an example of what a tenement would have looked like, right? Without any insulation, with very little room. And again, this view is essentially what one room looked like in a one-room tenement. Okay? I also want to point out here a poster from this period signed by Mayor LaGuardia in New York. Keep your fire escapes clean. Right? Particularly in these tenements, because there was very little space, people would often use their fire escapes for all sorts of things, for storage, for cleaning, for drying laundry. And so this often led to tragedy. This could lead, and in some cases did lead to tragedy, because the fire escape couldn't use for its intended purpose. And if you have poor ventilation, then you're going to likely have fires, and you're going to need to escape those fires. So very much a hallmark of life on the Lower East Side. Fire escapes, by the way, became mandatory in New York City in 1901. So even the whole notion of a fire escape was still only about, let's say, 20 years old by the end of this period. Yes?
And also in the extreme heat, people slept on fire escapes.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, there are images of that also, for sure. Here what we have is a look at two different things. First of all, the child labor that he was referring to, a family sitting around the table, sewing together garments and pieces of garments. This was very typical. This was not an atypical situation. And here, of course, we have sweatshops, which included women and children in cramped quarters with very little ventilation. I just want to point out one thing, if we want to really kind of unpack what Rosenzweig was talking about in terms of everybody being obligated to work, which is that the reality of child labor was a little more complex, right, than simply a system that subjugated children. Because in fact, many immigrant and other poor families depended on the money that their children brought home, in addition to the small incomes that a husband and wife were able to piece together. So if you were to approach an immigrant at this time, someone living on the Lower East Side, and ask about how awful it was that their child had to work, many would say, but that's how we subsist, right? And so I'm not trying to say it was a whole good situation, but the reality is that it's kind of easier to look on it in kind of in hindsight when there are child labor laws in place that are much more enforced. And if you don't come from a perspective of poverty, right, than it was at the time. So it was a complex situation. The last piece that I want to show you right now, we talked about fire, the prospects of fire, sweatshops, fire escapes. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, very, very famous fire that happened in March of 1911. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, and there have been full articles written about this very tragic situation. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company had locked the doors to the stairwells and exits for two reasons. One is they didn't want their workers to be taking too many breaks, and also because they didn't want people to steal from workers to steal, right, from the company. So when this fire erupted in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, many of the workers couldn't escape the building, and many of them jumped out from the top floor. An image that I think for us is even more resonant now than it would have been, 20 years ago. This fire actually led to legislation that required improved factory safety standards, and really helped spur on the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, very, very famous union, right, which fought for better working conditions for sweatshop workers. And here you see an article from the Evening Telegram of New York. It says, "Heroic young forewoman loses her life to save others from death in flames." There's many victims of these fires, and really most of them women, because that's who worked in the sweatshop. Very tragic. So Rosenzweig was witness to all of this, right? Either in the moment or having arrived shortly after some of these things happened. So this is his critique of the social, right? The social and the social, the cultural, the political, the economic. But his fellow East European Jewish immigrants were also objects of his derision, particularly in that he really accuses them of abandoning external elements of their own culture that would identify them as non-American. So, for example, he was very upset that they anglicized their names. The idea of anglicizing their names meant letting go of a very important piece of who you were, of wearing American clothing, as he said, even if its quality does not match that of the garments from the old country. Right there, they made them well. Here, you're giving that up for this flimsy material, but it's American, so you wear it. Rosenzweig really bemoans these changes that allow East European immigrants to strip themselves of their particular religious and cultural characteristics. And as he says, once the greenhorn is no longer green, he really becomes ashamed of the others instead of coming directly to their aid. So the accusation against the immigrants that they abandoned their brothers and sisters really speaks to a broader issue of the East European Jewish immigrant experience in America. Right? They had uprooted themselves. They resettled in a totally foreign land, and they were dependent, I'm going to say, on two major sources of support to assist them through the adjustment, and often enough just to subsist until they could do so independently. One category of assistance were, of course, the Landsmannschaften. Right? Landsmannschaften were hometown benevolent societies that frequently aided landsmen, or people who had come from the same town that you had come from, mostly in Eastern and East Central Europe. And often they would help them with everything from travel arrangements, right? Not everyone, as in that lullaby, not every father had money then to send home to his family to come to America. Often they would help families come by sending money, and then provided them with everything from social networks, social gatherings, to interest-free loans. That was also an important piece of it, funeral assistance when that was necessary, and a lot more. And here you have gatherings of various Landsmannschaften, both formal pictures at dinners, and here, in terms of the burial assistance, if you go to many, many cemeteries throughout the United States, you'll see, right, areas of Jewish cemeteries that are called here the scholar, right, and so the scholars, people from that community who are having bought burial plots together and helping each other with financial assistance for funerals. So that was one category of assistance, that Jews gave each other, the Landsmannschaften. The second category of assistance came from the second generation Jews in America, but we're not talking about when we talk about the second generation Jews. When you say second generation Jews and talking about American Jewish history of this period, you're not talking about the kids of the Eastern European immigrants. You're talking about the people who had arrived, the second generation of German Jews who had arrived in the 19th century. That's what we mean by second generation. So this second generation of really acculturated, if not assimilated, but certainly acculturated, right? Jews from Western Europe and Central Europe were often known as uptown Jews because they tended to live uptown, right, in the midtown or really uptown, what was then uptown. And very famously, they had a complicated relationship with the downtown Jews. On the one hand, they had a reputation of really being ashamed of their unrefined and poor and religiously devout, which for them often meant like much more devout than they themselves were at that point, which for them also meant backward, right? Like, this is what my brother looks like. This is what my landsman, not my landsman because he's not from my area, but basically my fellow Jew looks like. They felt ashamed of them. But on the other hand, or maybe also because of that shame, it was probably a mix of on the other hand and because of that shame, the uptown Jews took a primary role in helping the downtown Jews by providing them with education and with jobs and with other necessities for living in their new homes. And what you often had was downtown Jews aspiring to become uptown Jews. So here's an example of Yiddish theater, right? Of musical comedy that was a musical comedy that was created based on this uptown-downtown Jew distinction. I'm going to play a quick song for you right now. A moment.
Wir wollen zusammen glücklich sein, wir wollen sie fliegen, nett und fein. Alle Linie, mir noch Häuser schienen, wir wollen sie fliegen, nett und fein, alle glücklich sein. From downtown, uptown, was born in Häuser schienen, from downtown, uptown, sie fliegen wie Gewirr. From downtown, uptown, wir werden dort rein. Landsleit fällen uns bekannt sein. Jo, jo. From downtown, uptown, was born in Häuser schienen. From downtown, uptown, sie fliegen wie Gewirr. From downtown, uptown, wir werden dort rein. Landsleit fällen uns bekannt sein. Jo, jo.
Okay, there you go. Hold on a moment. Okay. This actually is probably an appropriate time to point out that notwithstanding the writings of Rosenzweig and Weinberger and people like that, and the images that we've seen here, Jewish life on the Lower East Side could also be very culturally and socially rich, right? So, for example, Yiddish theater was very, very prominent and provided a huge source of entertainment for Jews in this period. Jews were very involved in politics, increasingly involved in politics, especially at this time in socialist politics, but not only in socialist politics. And the fact that Jews were highly visible and with a lot of productive interaction with non-Jews, as you see here, the visibility, right? So you have the sign for a Jewish store peddling their wares or advertising their wares in both English and in Hebrew. Not Hebrew, Yiddish. In both English and in Yiddish, placed very, very prominently on the Lower East Side. Okay. I'm going to try to get through our next two pieces quickly, although I want to be sensitive to time, so I would also be happy to share some things. I'll skip a few things and share later if anyone would like. So Jewish immigrant literature is an area in which women are actually very nicely represented with very colorful and very affecting stories. The book Bread Givers by Anzia Jezierska, who was one of the women on the first slide I showed you, Anzia Jezierska was a Polish immigrant who was born in the 1880s, came to America in the 1890s, and was well known a century ago. She wrote a lot, but she's very, very less well known now. And very much less well known now. I actually had to read this book in graduate school. It's not one of these things that's sort of part of the general curriculum, I think, for Jewish history students. Bread Givers was published in 1925 in a form of English that really represents the colloquial style of the Yiddish turned English speaker of this period. It's an autobiographic novel that depicts the trials and tribulations of Sarah Smolinski, who's the alter ego of Anzia Jezierska. Okay? So like Anzia, Sarah is the daughter of a Talmudic scholar who lives with his wife and daughters in a cramped tenement on the Lower East Side. And like Anzia, Sarah Smolinski's experiences of home is dominated by two themes in her life that are always intertwined in Bread Givers: poverty and subjugation to men. Her father, potential suitors, all men. These troubles lead Sarah and actually led Anzia to escape home, get a job, and live an independent life. They were incredibly affecting. In Bread Givers, landlords demand rent that the family can't pay. The family depends on the oldest daughter, Bessie, for meager wages from a job she doesn't even have. And Bessie is essentially coerced into a marriage to a man that she so abhors, it's very palpable in the book, just so that the family can reap financial gain from that union. Sarah's father resents her mother for bearing him only daughters, so that he doesn't have a Kaddish, right? And she writes, "The prayers of his daughters didn't count because God didn't listen to women. Heaven and the next world were only for men. Women have no brains for the study of God's Torah, but they could be servants of men who studied the Torah. Only if they cooked for the men, washed for the men, and didn't nag or curse the men out of their homes, then maybe they could push themselves into heaven with the men to wait on them there." So we could ask, what about this story is even American? Let's just pause for a second, right? Sarah's family would most likely have experienced poverty in Eastern Europe, and its internal dynamics, particularly the gender dynamics, would most definitely have been similar. But this is an American story, an American Jewish immigration story, for a few reasons. First, because of the very fact that it was written and published. That would not have happened in Poland at the time, certainly not for a woman from the Polish shtetl. Second, because it really voices the sort of women's discontentedness and anger that would have been largely repressed in that life, if they were even knowledgeable enough to feel it. Third, because Sarah runs away and finds American independence. And finally, because we know from her prolific writing that Anzia Jezierska understood her own mission as that of representing the barriers that females in particular, female immigrants in particular, had to encounter as they attempted to acculturate. It's really telling that the subtitles of Bread Givers, which you don't see here, is a struggle between a father of the old world and a daughter of the new. So if for Rosenzweig and Weinberger the challenge lies in American society and in Jewish religious society, for Jezierska it lies in the obstacles on the way to becoming full-fledged members of that society because of their gender. The last venue that I want to just mention quickly for telling the story of the American Jewish immigrant was the Yiddish Forward, right? Very, very famous newspaper, part of the Yiddish press, but really the most prominent newspaper, which really reported on immigrants' lives, both at home, back in the old country, and in their new countries, as well as on current events. So here I'm just showing you two front pages of the Forward. One is here, after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where it says the morgue is full of our victims. It's really very, very powerful headline there. And that's internal, right? That's a local, what's it called? Home. Home news. And then the other one is from the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, where it says Stalin and Hitler make a pact. Russia guarantees the Nazis not to fight a war. Which will no longer be true a few years later. But in any case, so this is the forward, and this is how they got their news. But it's also how they told their own story, not only here, but also because of the very famous Bintel brief, or bundle of letters, which was an advice column that existed in every issue of the Forward, where immigrants could write in and ask for advice about things that were challenging in their lives. And it really is to read the Bintel brief letters is to read the story, heartfelt, heartrending, and sometimes story of American Jewish immigration in this period. So I would love to go through all of these with you. I won't, but I have. Many of the Bintel brief letters have been compiled. So I'm going to do highlights, then we're going to end. Right? My brother-in-law said it wasn't nice to read a Jewish newspaper on the train. I know America is a free country, so why should I have to be ashamed of my language here? I've been here in America for several years. We kept sending money back to my mother and sister. Suddenly we got a letter from mother telling us that on the way one of our sisters was detained because she had trachoma in her eyes. Classic story. Because of things going on in Russia, here in this small town, I went to work in Russia, we came to America. I went to work in a shop. In the shop, there is a foreman who is an exploiter. He often allows himself to have fun with some of the working girls. My son distinguished himself in chemistry all through high school. In this profession, there's no future for Jewish graduates. I didn't want to believe that in America, in such a free land, it was so, but recently I met a graduate, a Jewish chemist, and he confirmed there are no large Jewish firms that hire chemists. And among non-Jewish firms, there's a sort of understanding to keep Jews out of the profession. Okay. 1932. This is another one about discrimination on the job. Oops, go back one. Okay, so here we have. We'll get to this in a second. So the Bintel brief really is a way for us to really kind of engage very deeply with the struggles that East European Jewish immigrants were not only living but also really expressing and had the forum to express. And I'm not showing you the responses because I think the letters themselves tell the story. I want to conclude. Back to the beginning, we looked at a broad cross-section of immigrant writers in the United States. So as I said, Jhumpa Lahiri is one of my favorites. And I want to conclude with a quote from one of her short stories in her very, very beautiful book, Interpreter of Maladies, where she writes, "While the astronauts, heroes forever, spent mere hours on the moon, I have remained in this new world for nearly 30 years. I know that my achievement is quite ordinary. I'm not the only man," says the person saying this, "to seek his fortune far from home, and certainly I'm not the first. Still, there are times I am bewildered by each mile I have traveled, each meal I have eaten, each person I have known, each room in which I have slept. As ordinary as it all appeared, there are times when it is beyond my imagination." This is very, very much, I think, this really universalizes the experience, right? We can say that the East European Jewish immigration is a Jewish story, we can say that it's an American story, and we can say that it's an immigration story, and there is something beautiful and I think resonant about being able to find the similarities internally in our own Jewish history, as well as the similarities of the experience of immigration, as Lahiri points out here. Thank you all very much. Have a good day. I'm happy to answer questions, but I also wanted to leave us to end on time as possible. Yeah.
Okay, so there's two things. One is now I understand better when we went to Poland, and there were times that they said that the fathers didn't want them to leave during the war to come to America.
Yeah.
This makes it a little more understandable if they were reading these things in Hebrew or knew of them, that they didn't want their children to leave, and that's why they died in the Holocaust. There's actually a fabulous, at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, I just went, there's a very good exhibit on the American living, not Jews, but Americans and how they reacted to what was going on in the war because of it. And also, we took our children, when she was 10, now she's 30, but she's 10, we took them to the Tenement Museum, and my daughter saw underneath the bed a bowl and a cup, and she says, oh my gosh, they washed Nagelwasser. And she called my father-in-law who lived on the Lower East Side. He said, no, that's where we went to the bathroom. There was no bathroom. Sometimes in the kitchen sink. He was very graphic.
Yeah.
And she really learned, really.
Yeah, the Tenement Museum is
Yes,
incredibly
you must see it.
moving.
It's fabulous.
It's like you've just familiar with that history.
Could you
Thank
do
you.
me one more favor? Could you just go back to the bun thing so I could take a picture of it? The name of the brief? Thanks. Appreciate
Are
it.
any of Rosenzweig's things published in English?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Rosenzweig, are any of his books published in the Talmudic
So I'm not
Paris?
familiar with any translation. I've seen one or two of them. I have one of
That was
them.
it.
No, especially the
but-
Talmudic parody.
But
No.
sorry.
No, no.
That one.
No.
I got it. I've not seen any translation. Anytime I've done it, anytime I've used this and I've had to translate it myself. I recently saw an article that was published about 5 years ago, in which also that person did his own translation. So I'm not sure that's it.
This was fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, that's a new project for you.
That's right. Translation of
My daughter was supposed to pick me up at 12:05, and I said to change it.